Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Fiber Broadband Association's Five for Breakfast. We're now in our 15th episode of 2026. Our gold sponsor for Fiber Breakfast is Conducts. Well, I hope everybody has submitted their taxes due today at the IRS. Always one of our favorite days of the year, especially our CFO loves getting to spend all his weeks getting up to April 15th. So we're also just 5 weeks out. 5 weeks from our annual Fiber Connect 2026 conference at the Gaylord Palms in Orlando, May 17th through May 20th. And we are anticipating record attendance again this year, as this will be the largest and best fiber broadband event in the world. So if you haven't registered, please go to our website and register today. You're not going to miss it. If you thought last year was great, this year the guys have pulled out all the stops, so I can't wait. And last week on Five for Breakfast, our guest was our good friend Jim Stegman, the CEO of CostQuest, who discussed the state of broadband, what the data really reveals. And as you may know, CostQuest handles the broadband data collection from ISPs for the FCC. And so Jim always has some very interesting insights when we get the ISP service provider data, twice a year. So you're not going to want to miss, or if you miss that, you want to go to the replay and see what Jim had to say about the latest data. But today on Five for Breakfast, our guest is Jeff Lopez. He's the director of the Office of Broadband Access and Expansion, OBAE. I don't know, Jeff, if you have a quick way to saying that, OBAE, to discuss
Typically we say OBAE.
OBAE. All right. So Jeff's the director of OBAE. And smart funding, smart development, and the strategy for driving 100% coverage. So Jeff brings over 12 years of federal experience in support of New Mexicans. Prior to this appointment, Lopez has served as a senior policy advisor and state staff to U.S. Senator Senator Ben Ray Lujan. Lopez managed the senator's role as the chairman of the Subcommittee on Communications, Media, and Broadband, and worked directly on legislation that created Federal Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Act, through which New Mexico is receiving $675 million to connect unserved and underserved households across the state. Jeff attended Georgetown University, McCourt School of Public Policy. We earned a master's of public policy. So with that, welcome, Jeff. And for our audience, please type in your questions and go, and we'll get things started. So Jeff,
Thanks,
how
Gary.
is it being back in New Mexico after spending so much time in D.C.?
It's been good. It's been good. I'm born and raised in Santa Fe, so it is returning home for me. But I certainly miss being in D.C. There's a lot of throughput with me working on some of the legislation in Congress that now I'm in a place to administer. So it's a personal point of privilege where I'm able to see how the language and the law has been working on the ground, in some cases not working, but implementation is always the last and hardest step that we're seeing pretty dramatically here with BEAD.
So before we get started, maybe, New Mexico is pretty diverse. Can you talk a little about the topology and kind of what the industry and kind of when you look across your state, kind of the facets that make New Mexico a little different than the other 56 states or 55 states and territories?
Yeah, so it's New Mexico is very diverse, both in topography, the geography of the state, as well as the population. We have the central corridor, which pretty much follows the Rio Grande Valley down from Colorado through central New Mexico, south through Texas and the Mexico border. We have the Sangre de Cristo Mountains in the northern part of the state, which is the southern portion of the Rocky Mountains. And then we have the Sandias and other mountain ranges, largely due to fault zones throughout central and southern New Mexico. There are mountains in every part of the state. We have Mount Taylor, we have Ruidoso. Each one is a beautiful place to visit. So I definitely recommend everybody who hasn't come to New Mexico, come check it out. But it also makes it very difficult for broadband. So whether it is fiber or fixed wireless or low Earth orbit satellite, mountains and valleys can present unique challenges and unique costs when it comes to deploying broadband. So the main intent of the New Mexico State Legislature creating the Office of Broadband in 2021 is to address many of those challenges. We have unique circumstances in the state where the federal government might not necessarily be aware or talking to local stakeholders about their unique challenges. So our role has primarily been coordination throughout the course of the existence of the Office of Broadband, and of course with state and federal funds administering those grant programs to make sure they work effectively on the ground here in New Mexico.
And how would you describe the industry? Is it largely agricultural, and what other kind of big industries are in New Mexico?
Yeah, so we have a long tradition, and part of the diversity in the state comes from the long history. Santa Fe is one of the oldest cities in the country, established by European settlers, and we have one of the longest permanently occupied communities as well, with Taos Pueblo in northern New Mexico, which has a history going back thousands, tens of thousands of years. So we have the native indigenous community, where I've been spending a lot of my time since I started, meeting directly government to government with the pueblos, nations, and tribes across New Mexico. And then the Spanish settlers coming in over 400 years ago, and of course the United States expanding its territory into the state. That has really contributed to industry today. We have a long tradition of agriculture, again, mostly along that Rio Grande Valley, a unique system of water controls, whether it's acequias and what are called water ditches in southern New Mexico, that contributes to our agriculture. We have a strong base for pistachios in southern New Mexico, one of our main exports, as well as other nut-bearing trees. We also have a lot of federal facilities in New Mexico. Los Alamos National Labs, where they built the first atomic bombs, is still very active there in northern New Mexico in Los Alamos County. Sandia National Lab here in Albuquerque. We have 3 main Air Force bases across the state. So the federal government is a big part of our economy today. The oil and gas industry is very big in New Mexico and southern and southeastern New Mexico with the Permian Basin. That contributes a lot to our state revenues through licensing and fees. And of course, my job is to make sure all these very different communities, the history, the industries, that each one, whether it's a household or a small business, a school, a major institution, or a national lab, has the connectivity that they need to be successful here in New Mexico. So on top of our grant making to the last mile households and small businesses, we are responsible for trying to complete the picture, identify needs, work with internet service providers and private industry to complete that broadband network throughout New Mexico. And I would say the majority of that relies heavily on fiber. So I'm very happy to be meeting with the Fiber Broadband Association today.
Well, great. So Jeff, coming from DC, when you were, managing the center's role as the chairman of the Subcommittee on Communications, Media, and Broadband, and working on back, gosh, it seems like, half decade ago, that we had this thing called the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. So tell me, since you kind of were there at the genesis of all this, maybe reflect the moment on kind of what you had envisioned back a half a decade ago and kind of where you see things are, and good, bad, ugly kind of reflection.
Yeah, it's a great question. So one of my favorite pastimes working on telecom issues in DC is tallying how many people wrote the 1996 Telecommunications Act. And there's a good amount of people who had the pen in that bill, but it took many years to come up with that comprehensive approach to telecom at a very unique time in 1996, when the public internet was just really taking off and expanding at a rapid pace. I was coming in with trying to connect those dots, where the IIJA, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, ended up was pretty far from where the existing law was with universal service and the 1996 Telecommunications Act. My boss, Senator Ben Ray Lujan, at the time was not part of that bipartisan infrastructure group, but he was chairman of the subcommittee of jurisdiction over broadband. So what started out as a conversation of $100 billion for broadband infrastructure eventually was negotiated $65 billion, and then there was a lot of debate, a lot of discussion on how to divide up that $65 billion. What the group ended up with was $42.5 billion for the BEAD program, $18 billion for the Affordable Connectivity Program, resources for the Digital Equity Act. There was a lot of moving pieces, but it ended up with sort of that balance. And it did end up sort of reflecting the balance of the 96 Telecommunications Act, where it had a focus on high cost, but also education and affordability, and what ended up as the 4 major programs at the FCC. So the picture with the passage of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act was having that main bucket for infrastructure, for that capital infrastructure that you know very well is very expensive, especially in rural areas where market and private industry was not able to really serve. They didn't identify the rate of return as worth it to go into those areas, so the government had to step in and make sure to complete that picture. Also, the Affordable Connectivity Program, ACP, with $18 million from that bill, was the next part of the picture, making sure that households not only had the physical network, the connectivity needed to access the internet, but the ability to afford it. And then the Digital Equity Act was an important part, making sure that the populations intended to be served by this, whether it's a rural population, tribal, the elderly population, vulnerable populations that speak languages other than English, that everybody was able to fully participate and enroll in these programs. So that was the intent there. Obviously, the picture has changed, as you said, over 5 years, half a decade. Where we are today is a little bit different from where Congress was when they passed the IIJA. And now we are in a place where we are approaching 100% connectivity in New Mexico in terms of that physical infrastructure, making sure every household, every small businesses has access to the network. And an important barrier still remains with affordability and digital literacy and digital opportunity. So that's sort of the present and future for what we need to focus on here in New Mexico. So
you guys, when you got your allocation, $675 million, you ended up, after the benefit of the bargain, 382-ish. Did that give you enough money to get what you needed to do to be able to get that full connectivity?
Yes. The short answer is yes. Obviously, it's a much more complicated, long answer. But by the end of this year, 2026, we plan to have enforceable commitments, those signed grant agreements, to serve every single location in New Mexico. I'm saying 100% of the small businesses, 100% of the households in New Mexico will have that obligation to provide service. Obviously, the construction won't be complete by the end of this year. That'll take some time. And depending on whether it's low Earth orbit satellite or licensed fixed wireless or fiber, the timelines, and depending on the area, a lot of rights of way, a lot of federal rights of way in New Mexico that can present unique challenges. So the actual construction timeline will be a little bit different. But that $382 million with our approved final proposal to NTIA will get service to all of those locations. There is still going to be gaps. We just got a new version of the FCC maps that changed locations. We're trying to determine if they're new locations or just shifts in existing locations. And then obviously we still need the ISPs to step up and say which locations they can provide service to. But that's going to go on. And that was the intent of the Broadband Data Act, where you have this continuous mapping process, not just using census tracts or generalized information about communities, but those individual locations and making sure they have access to broadband. So that'll continue, and that means we'll never quite reach 100.0% of connectivity. We're hoping to get as far, as close to it as possible, 99.9. But we're always going to have that new generation of maps, the new locations that we need to get clarity on. I'm always very concerned about lapses, about defaults in existing federal programs or our state programs or future potential failures to comply with BEAD and get that construction done. And we don't have it. We have a couple of small projects over the past that received federal funding outside of our programs that have unfortunately defaulted. And we fully anticipate, we don't know which ones will be in that situation, but we need to prepare for the future where we have those future defaults. And that will determine whether we can reach fully 100%, whether we have the resources to accommodate those inevitable changes to our maps and broadband service throughout the state. So yes, short answer, yes. With $382 million, we're planning to reach every single location in New Mexico. But the long answer is obviously more complex and as you know, requires some concerted effort and attention.
Okay, so let's just say that you get everybody connected. I'm a little suspect with the low Earth orbit satellite, but we'll just for grins, we'll just say everybody's connected. So now, when you had envisioned and when you guys were working, as you outlined, not only get the infrastructure out there, but also to get the adoption and connectivity and affordability, ACP kind of ran out of gas before we even got on the road. Tell us a little bit about how you're dealing with the low-income situation in New Mexico.
Yeah, I'm very proud to say that the New Mexico State Legislature passed Senate Bill 152. This legislative session, we only had 30 days to get it done, but it was passed and signed into law by Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham just last week, or a week and a half ago now. And that will establish an ACP-like system here in New Mexico. It was sponsored by Senator Michael Padilla in Bernalillo County and co-sponsored by two representatives. Saranyana was one, and they were critical to getting this done and across the finish line here in New Mexico. I assisted with resources at the Office of Broadband to draft legislation and provide technical assistance, but the credit is really to those legislators. And they only have 30 days where they're up in Santa Fe getting this done. But this was a priority, and I am very proud to say the state legislature got it signed by the governor a week and a half ago. This uses a section of existing law. We have the State Rural Universal Service Fund here in New Mexico. It's been in place for over 20 years. We also have the low-income telephone assistance program today, but that's very underutilized. It's only about $300,000 per year, just a handful of locations, and it's only $3.50 a month in terms of support for those low-income households for accessing just telephone. This bill will modernize that program, so it expands it. We're going to increase the cap to $10 million a year with those state rural universal service funds in the first year, and then up to $45 million in every year after that. This is part of a permanent fund, the State Rural Universal Service Fund. So unlike the Affordable Connectivity Program that had to go back to Congress, and Congress said no additional appropriations, this will continue to exist unless the legislature revisits and wants to make changes to the statute. The State Rural Universal Service Fund will also support high-cost areas in New Mexico, what's called access reduction support, as well as maintain a state broadband program for up to $12 million a year. And that is now there to fill some of those gaps, to get us from 99.9 to 100% in the future. And again, I don't know what locations are going to need it. I don't know what that support is necessarily going to look like, but it'll be available both for that capital infrastructure to complete the picture and potentially for operations and maintenance where we really need this essential service to continue to exist into the future. But with LITAP, Low-Income Telecommunications Assistance Program, that is now there permanently, where companies can apply to our Public Regulation Commission. That's the agency that's going to be responsible for administering this program and administers the State Rural Universal Service Fund today. They have to get eligible telecommunication carrier status, just like with participation in the Federal Lifeline program. And then the state subsidy will be on top of that lifeline. So where it's $9 and change at the federal level, which many companies don't believe is necessary, is enough, is $9 is not enough to provide that service to low-income households. Now you have the state level of subsidy, which again, the goal is ACP, where it's $30 a month for low-income households and $75 a month for tribal households. And that completes the picture. That means that companies that are here in New Mexico or looking to invest in that broadband infrastructure in New Mexico now can look at those low-income areas and make a plan to serve them. Because there's this direct support, it is no longer an afterthought. Those low-income areas throughout the state and the areas that they might have to serve through franchise agreements or other commitments, or just if they have the resources available, now it can be a priority for investing in low-income households in New Mexico and making sure that everybody in New Mexico has that critical access to broadband internet in the future.
So one of the things I always struggle with is, well, first of all, congratulations. It's really important that broadband's affordable, and I see these programs as, I call them self-healing, in that the more people you get on broadband, then it quickly moves people out of low income to be able to grow their income, because they now can work from home, get online education, access, so when you think about low income, you're having to work all these jobs and trying to get from place to place to place. And when you're able to use broadband, it really improves your efficiency, improves your ability to grow your wage through education and just proximity to more job opportunities. So hopefully the program goes away on its own by everybody moving out of low income, which is great. But one of the things I struggle with is when you look at your technology neutral mix, you know, like Google Fiber, good gigabit, $70 a month. Leo, like Starlink, is $120 a month. So you get really bad broadband for $50 more a month than getting gigabit. So how can, and I'm assuming that the low income, you know, people that are going to be applying for this, the SB 152 subsidy, are going to be probably more likely to get Leo than they are gigabit. So they're going to be paying $50 at least more for very low bandwidth. How do you overcome that? I mean, it seems like wasteful of, you know, wouldn't it be better to make sure that they have high quality broadband at a cheaper price and then subsidize that rather than having real expensive bad broadband?
No, that's a very good question, and obviously a very complex one as well when it comes to subsidizing service in areas that aren't able to sustain it with the market, or competition is the alternative. One of the really strong points of the Affordable Connectivity Program was that it gave it to the household to decide. A household can take that. Obviously, they have to apply. They have to make sure the household's eligible, but then they can choose the broadband service that is right for them. I want to make sure that the companies that are participating are invested in New Mexico, that they have facilities here, that it's not a company that's fly-by-night coming in and trying to take this government subsidy and not really invest in the resources and people we have here. But that being said, if a company's willing to commit and have facilities here, then it should be up to the household to decide what service is right for them. So whether it is a location served by wireless, or a location served by fiber, or a location served by low Earth orbit satellite, I certainly hope that those companies providing that service work with the Public Regulation Commission, work with our maps, and are willing to provide that service. Competition will provide the answer here. If a household is able to choose between a fiber provider that offers service at a lower rate to begin with, and then you apply the subsidy on top of that, and then if a low Earth orbit satellite provider comes in at $100, $150 a month, and then you only get $30 a month off of that, I imagine the household will go what's the lower cost to them, especially low-income households that are choosing between very difficult decisions, putting food on the table, accessing education, workforce development training, and broadband internet. They have limited resources, and I imagine they'll make the decision that's best for them. So competition here is an answer, but obviously, especially when it comes to broadband and communications, there's not competition everywhere. And that's one of the challenges that government is really involved to address. You either are required to regulate a single provider of last resort for a household, making sure that that household has the services they need, or sometimes you can subsidize service as well. So it's a difficult question, but again, my priority is making sure that either those households have the broadband internet they need for access to healthcare, access to education, access to all those essential services, or that there's competition where the household has those choices and can make the choice that's right for them.
So Jeff, the other thing that I don't know how you thread the needle on this, but obviously with the current administration, a lot of concern about rate regulation. And as you're having to try to dial in affordability, how are you able to thread the needle to make sure that you provide the subsidy for people to be able to afford the service without getting caught in the trap of, you know, concerns about rate regulation?
Yeah, and I saw this debate illustrated pretty clearly with negotiations over the New Mexico bill, SB 152, and the road to passage. We did not see any national associations come in and oppose, and when I was talking to many of them, they were encouraged to see what New Mexico is doing, because rather than the approach that other states are taking with what NTIA has phrased rate regulation, where a state is mandating a certain cost to provide certain services, we here in New Mexico are now subsidizing the services that we want to see. So we still need those minimum speed requirements. I now administer both BEAD and ARPA here at the Office of Broadband, which has 120 and the latency requirements. And we want to make sure that affordability is supporting services that those households need. But rather than mandating the cost, we now have a position to make sure those low-income households can afford it. sometimes that'll bring the cost even down to zero with that subsidy.
Yeah.
So it's a different approach to the same problem. But when I was working both with our local stakeholders, the coalition that led to passage of the bill, and the national associations that were sort of monitoring what we were doing, it seemed like there was a lot of acceptance, both from industry and advocacy and public policy, that the approach we're taking in New Mexico is the right one.
Yeah, no, it's congratulations on that. It's a real shame when Commissioner or Chairman Rosenwasser allowed ACP to die and pushed it back on Congress when they probably could have funded through USF. But so let's look at, so you had almost $300 million now of non-deployment funds for BEAD. I'm obviously the Commerce will have some thoughts on what you can do with this money, but what would you like to be able to do with the remaining funds that you may have available to you guys?
Yeah, and that was the main point of discussion and debate at the NTIA conference in DC at the beginning of March. Making sure that states have the flexibility and the ability to spend those funds. Again, the intent of BEAD, as passed by Congress, was to give that to states to administer, to establish state broadband offices with the capacity to handle many of these difficult questions. I have both participated in NTIA's listening sessions in February and sent a letter to NTIA Administrator Ariel Roth on February 17th, asking for that, making sure that states are recognized with the ability they have, the ability they've developed over the BEAD process. We went through 2 initial proposals. We went through the final proposal, the initial round of bidding, the benefit of the bargain round, and many states are administering the ARPA capital projects funds or state funds for broadband. So I believe that every state now has that capacity to handle what we determine to be eligible uses under the law, under the statute for that non-deployment funds or the BEAD savings. What New Mexico wants to do with it, and what I had proposed both in that listening session and in my letter to Administrator Roth, is to support BEAD, first and foremost. There's a lot of critical infrastructure that can reduce the overall cost of BEAD, whether it is that middle mile or long haul fiber, the strategic infrastructure. It's under the statute that BEAD is intended to support 5G and wireless communications. It wasn't spelled out on exactly how states should do that, but that's also one of the non-deployment uses. Also, workforce development. New Mexico is very fortunate to have a $1.9 million grant from the U.S. Department of Labor, thanks to our congressional delegation foreseeing this problem with making sure that every state has the workforce to build these networks. So we have the $1.9 billion. We have deployed it. We are under contract with BICSI, the internationally recognized fiber certifier, as well as our workforce, Department of Workforce Solutions here in New Mexico, who handles WIOA with U.S. Department of Labor. So it's within the federal structure for workforce training. I would like to see it expand into apprenticeships as well. But now we have this pilot program of $1.9 million to train New Mexico communities on how to build these fiber networks, to not just support broadband, to support what the state wants to do with quantum infrastructure, what a lot of private industry is interested in terms of data centers. All of that relies on fiber connectivity. And now with this program, we have the workforce training to make sure that workers here in New Mexico, working families here in New Mexico, have the ability to do the work. And we're not looking for out-of-state contractors to come in under high demand from other states as well. But now we're creating that domestic workforce here in the United States and here in New Mexico. So I'm looking to use those BEAD non-deployment funds to expand what we have done with the U.S. Department of Labor and expand it to other communities, and an apprenticeship program is the ideal. So there's a lot of uses, but the bottom line is we have a plan for that almost $300 million. It is critical for the future of connectivity here in the state.
Well, Jeff, New Mexico is so lucky to have you, both your experience up on the Hill and now back home. And I really appreciate everything you and your office are doing to make sure not only does everybody have, get connectivity, but they're able to afford it and be able to use it and adopt it and be able to be trained, make sure you have all those good technicians. So you're doing amazing work. So thank you for everything you're doing.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you for having me on today. And back at you. Thank you for everything that the Fiber Broadband Association does to support connectivity here in New Mexico and across the country.
Well, I want to thank our audience for joining us today and look forward to getting back together next Wednesday. Our guests are going to be Jamie Linderman and Albeda Fellenbaum, the research analyst from Omnia, to discuss the latest trends and developments in the North American broadband market, the 2026 edition. They always have great data. It's going to be a fun session, so please join us next week. And again, Jeff, congratulations, and we look forward to seeing you in New Mexico sometime soon.